being attacked by the police in the Chicago area, and then so from there he went over to Sweden because you don't get justice in America often. But I'm very pleased to have Christopher here to talk about who did 9/11, and that's often what's avoided. They want to go about how did the building come down, blah blah blah. But let's find out really who did it. So thanks a lot. Thanks, Christopher.
Good evening, everybody. Nice to see you all. I'm really glad that they were able to, Tim was able to arrange this event on such short notice. This is my first time back in the United States in 7 years. I was prosecuted after some undercover police came to my house in Hoffman Estates, Illinois. They attacked me and they tasered me and broke my arm in front of my family. And then they prosecuted me, saying that I had assaulted them and resisted their arrest. Now, these were undercover police that wore no uniforms and refused to identify themselves. But first, let's start with the basics. My name is Christopher Bollyn, and I'm the author of a book called Solving 9/11. Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World. This is the main book. This is 360 pages long, and it presents the whole thesis of my work in very readable format. The layout is very easy on the eye, and it explains chapter by chapter who's behind the 9/11 crime, the whole history of this kind of false flag terrorism, who are the main people involved in it, and then it concludes with how they maintained the deception and how for 13 years. And the reason why I call it Solving 9/11, because a lot of people don't realize this, but the crime of 9/11, for example, the murder of 2,700 people in New York City, was never investigated as a crime. There was no investigation, because a criminal investigation starts with the evidence. And when the evidence from the mass murder of 2,700 people at the World Trade Center, the only thing that was left in the crime scene was steel and dust. And right away, they began taking the steel away, cutting it into small pieces, mixing it with other scrap, and sending it to China on a boat, never to be seen again. And that is, though, however, the crime scene where 2,700 people were killed. And what's particularly appalling about the deaths of these 2,700 people is 250 of them jumped from the towers. You saw some of them jumping because it was so incredibly hot up there above this area where all this molten iron was cooking, like on the 82nd floor of this tower number 2, that these people broke the windows and just it was like 200, 300 degrees Celsius inside the building. So they broke the windows and they were hanging off the side of the building, if you remember seeing that. And then they jumped. And a firefighter down below said, we can only wonder how bad it was up there that the better option was to jump. Well, so there was no investigation. And so it fell upon me as an independent journalist working in Washington, D.C., to start an investigation, to pursue this investigation, because I could see that the mainstream media and the government were basically in cahoots to sell us a myth, to sell us a complete fabrication, a myth, basically, and based on that myth, the country was going to war in October 2001. We already went to Afghanistan before there was any investigation, and there was no investigation. Then, so the main book is this one, Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World. Now, there are 2 books in this Solving 9/11 set. It's called a set because they have the same Library of Congress number and they go together. The second book, I only have a picture. This is about the size of it. It's called Solving 9/11, The Original Articles. And as a journalist, I was writing weekly articles about 9/11. Some years I wrote more, some years I wrote less. But I started in September 2001 because I happened to be in New York City that day and passing through early in the morning. And it changed. I knew that this event was going to change my life. It was going to change our nation. So I began writing right away and investigating. And I wrote until 2006, until the police attack. And then I continued writing. You know, they took away my income. I was fired from my job. I was prosecuted. And that's when I started getting really serious about this. Then I started writing the book. I went to Europe, and I realized that they were trying to They were trying to smear me, marginalize me. CNN called me an anti-Semite. Fox News called me an anti-Semite. And I'm neither. But that's what they do when when you're over the target, you get a lot of flack, basically. Now, this book contains 130 articles that I wrote from September 2001 until the spring of 2012. This book came out in June 2012. And these articles are in chronological order. And so when you read these articles, you can see how the evidence and how the thinking and the trail information leads to this inescapable conclusion that I come to in this book. And that's who's behind 9/11. I name the people, I describe how their history of doing this kind of thing. And I want to say, if you want to get, I don't have any of these copies with me because they arrived in California the day after I left. But if you want to get a copy of the Solving 9/11, the original article, you would have to tell me, and I have to write down your address, your phone number, and for $25, then I will send you one. One will be on the mail to you in 2 days. So that's how I have to handle that. And the third book I have up here, this is a book from a friend and a colleague named Jeff Gates. He was the general counsel for the U.S. Senate Finance Committee in the 1980s under Russell Long and Huey Long's son. And he explains how this transnational, transgenerational criminal syndicate that has taken control of our country, our finances, and is able to do things like this atrocity. He explains how they operate in the more general picture. So that's why I have this book. So these two books I have up here, they cost $20 per book. So that's what I have tonight for you. Now, who am I? I was born in Chicago. Grew up in Illinois, suburban Chicago, and I grew up in the church. I was an Eagle Scout. I was an altar boy, and I grew up during the Vietnam War. I grew up at a time, the Vietnam War was kicked off when I was in first grade, and the Vietnam War didn't end until I finished my last year of high school. So I grew up in that generation, in that time period where most of the people that I knew were against the war, and we were fighting this war in Southeast Asia that nobody could explain why we were really there. My mother, my father. But there was also a very vibrant anti-war music. The Woodstock generation, all the songs. There was a strong movement against the whole war industry. And to me, that made sense. And what I find most disturbing is that now we have been in a war in Iraq since 1991. It's like we're fighting a 23-year war already in Iraq, and we're not done yet. And as you know, I've just come back to the United States 3 weeks ago, but particularly now I've looked at CNN just to see what President Obama's going to say, and this whole thing about they're upscaling the war against Syria now. They're going to start bombing. They're bombing in Syria. They're bombing in Iraq. This is like phase 2 or phase 3 or phase 4. I don't know who keeps track of the whole deception that started with 9/11. 9/11 was September 11, 2001, the bombing of the World Trade Center and the bombing of the Pentagon. And that is the seminal event of our time. That is the crime, that is the atrocity that has shaped the America we live in now. It was the event that was meant to kickstart the war on terror and to change America. But what it's done most fundamentally, what I see, is that it's changed the relationship of the person to the state and the state to the person. That relationship today between how the state reacts to us and how we react to the state is different than I ever thought it would be in this country. Well, what I did is, I'll just tell a brief story about how I got started on 9/11. We were passing through New York City on September 11th in the morning, early in the morning. We were coming from Vermont. I had my wife, my 2 kids in the back seat. We were coming down from Stowe, Vermont. Was trying to get back to Washington, D.C. I had worked as a journalist for about 1 year and 3 months with a little newspaper in Washington, D.C. called the American Free Press, which I now have learned since I left that is basically a controlled opposition outfit. I'm sad to say that, but that's what it is. it's like these papers are established, and they give a lot of good information, and by giving a lot of good information, they get a lot of people, they corral this group of people around them. But what they're basically doing is they're co-opting any real patriotic movement in this country. So, but I was free to write. You know, I started writing with them in June 2000, and then very quickly, in the fall of 2000, they reduced my relationship with the paper to being an independent, I was an independent contractor. So that meant that I could, you know, write whatever I wanted. That's what I did. I wrote. And I had lived in Sweden before. I live in Sweden now, but I'd lived in Sweden, and I had seen how terrible things can happen, like a shipwreck called the Estonia sank. 1,000 people died, 502 Swedish people, and the very modern, very democratic state of Sweden swept the truth under the rug. And I saw that from 1994 until I came back to the States in 1996. And then I was just back in the States, and I saw TWA 800 went down in the summer of 1996. And I attended the hearings. I was very intrigued by that because that was a case where there were 125 people who were on Long Island that day, and they observed a missile streaking from the surface of the ocean, going up and hitting the plane and exploding. It was 125 people saw that. And I went to the final hearings of the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Agency, and after the 2 days, they said, at the very end, they dealt with these eyewitness testimony. And you know what they said? They said, well, we have to assume it was a very hot afternoon in Long Island. It was the end of the day. It was a weekend, I think it was. And they said that we figured that these people had all been drinking, and they hallucinated that. They all hallucinated a missile going up. And when I came out, that was the final hearing in the fall of 2000. I went back to the office, and I realized that this country had a problem. I had seen a cover-up in Estonia, in that country. Then I saw that they were doing the exact same thing in this country with TWA 800, complete lie. And you know, that's where they said that there was a spark in the central fuel tank, and that blew it up. And they created all kinds of fabrications to explain what people saw. So this is like the background. And I had, as a journalist, I wrote about these things, and I also wrote a great deal about the Middle East, because my specialty is Israel and Palestine. I have a degree in history from the University of California. And I had spent a lot of time in Israel. I've gone to the Intifada, I've seen the Intifada, I've seen all these things that Israel's been doing over the years. I was in Israel starting in 1975, and I spent a lot of time there in the late 70s. And I lived on a kibbutz. I was a lifeguard on a kibbutz there in the Jordan Valley, just by the Sea of Galilee. And I had an Israeli girlfriend, a very smart girl. And I was there when the Likud party took over, when Menachem Begin took over, when this Likud coalition came into power. Now, the Likud coalition is basically composed of the leaders of the former Zionist terror gangs, the Irgun, the Lehi, Stern Gang. So people like Shamir, Yitzhak Shamir, and Menachem Begin were the founders of this party. And when that Likud coalition came into power, Bosmat was very sad, and all the people on the labor kibbutzes were very sad. They said, this is the end of Israel, they said. They said, the terrorists have taken over. I didn't know what she meant by that, because I didn't quite, you know, my understanding of Zionist history wasn't that long as hers and her grandparents'. But they saw this as a black day for Israel. Now, that is a very important day, a very important event, because when these people took power, when Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir and their crew took over the power of the Israeli government, when they came to power, these are people who use terrorism as a strategic tool. They use terrorism to achieve their ends. This is not to say that other Israelis have not used terrorism, like in 1967 when the Israelis bombed the USS Liberty. That was not a Likud coalition government. Or in 1952, or 53, when they had the Lavon affair, when they bombed American and British buildings in Egypt. That was not a Likud government. But those events were done by the Likud guys who then came to power. When they blew up the King David Hotel, for example, Menachem Begin was the one who ran the operation. Tzipi Livni's father, Eitan Livni, was the manager of operations. They blew up the hotel because the British had gone on a raid throughout Palestine, and they had gotten a lot of evidence of Jewish agency involvement in the terrorism and crimes that were going on under the British mandate. And all that material, all that evidence was in this hotel in Jerusalem, which was British headquarters in the mandate period. So what Begin's crew, what these Jewish terrorists did, is that they dressed up like Arabs and took big 50-kilo cans of explosives and went down in the basement like they were delivering milk and put these big milk cans around the central core columns of the building, blew it up, and half the building fell down. All the evidence was destroyed, 90 people were killed. It's the worst act of terrorism thus far in Israeli-Palestinian relations. So that's my understanding. I knew these kinds of things. I studied Zionist history. And so when something happens that doesn't make sense, that affects the Middle East, like 9/11, you have to put on your thinking cap. And that's what I did, because when we left New York, we couldn't go back to New York City. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. We came through New York City. An odd thing, as we're passing Manhattan on the Jersey side, my wife was telling me a dream to keep me awake, in which she dreamed that we had been approaching in a car a city with a huge skyline. And she said she had this dream just when we left Chicago on this little week trip that we were making. And she said we were approaching the city with this huge skyline, like only New York has. And in her dream, she saw an airplane coming at our car, flying right at us from in front. And that plane went into the ground, she said, and she turned around and saw the plane come out of the ground behind the car and swirl around again. Then there were several planes, and they were attacking our car. It was what you call a vivid dream. She had this very vivid dream. And she's telling me this at 2 o'clock in the morning. Finally, we found a hotel just inside the Maryland boundary there. And in the morning, I saw the plane had crashed. I called the office. I said, I'm not coming to work today. I'm not coming to Washington. The Pentagon that got hit. And so I started taking the country roads across Pennsylvania to go home. And the first indication that was very important was Ted Koppel came on the news at about 12 o'clock on the radio. And Ted Koppel said that the FBI is looking for 5 Middle Eastern men who were seen videotaping the attack on the World Trade Center, and they had been celebrating it. And this is a news blurb. And I thought to myself, Middle Eastern, they could be Israeli. That's part of the Middle East, right? And it turned out the next day, 2 days later when I got home, I contacted the Paulo Lima at the Bergen Record, who is in New Jersey, and he had written about these 5 men who were captured in New Jersey by the local police and then turned over to the FBI. And they turned out to be Israelis. These are the 5 dancing Israelis, they're called. 2 of them are Mossad agents, and the other 3 were working for the Mossad agents. And they pretended to be moving men. They had a moving van, and they worked for Urban Moving Systems, which the Jewish newspaper, The Forward, revealed to be nothing but a Mossad front. It was a Mossad front company. That means it wasn't really a moving company. It was a company that was made to look like a moving company for another reason. And the FBI went to this office right away to find out about this company, and the owner of the company was an Israeli man named Dominic Suter. The FBI interviewed him the first time, but before they could interview him the second time, he fled the country. So the FBI probably must have let him flee the country, because if he's a suspect in something like 9/11, you keep pretty close tabs on him. You're not going to let them just leave the country because they want to go back to Israel. But these 5 chaps, two of them were called the Kurtzberg brothers. They were known Mossad operatives in the United States. They're on a list that law enforcement has. So these 2 boys were known to be Mossad agents. The other 3 were operatives. They were working for those 2 guys. And these chaps were held in, they had box cutters. The van tested positive for explosives. They had thousands of dollars stuck in their socks and multiple passports. They fit all the usual profile for people that are up to no good. But when they were captured, the New Jersey police, the FBI took over the investigation, took over the van, took over everything, and that was the end of it. Well, after that, I contacted Paulo Lima, and he he told me this story and everything that he had found in his research. But what was most peculiar about this is that this story of importance, great importance, was never printed in a New York paper. It's printed right across the Hudson River in the New Jersey papers, but it wasn't printed in the New York Times. It didn't get in the New York Post or anything. So then I realized that very important stories about 9/11 were being censored. They were being censored. Then, when you see that, you know something's up. When such important stories are censored. Another one was, you've probably heard of the story about the 4,000 Israelis who didn't show up for work that day. Now, this is a very simple story. It comes from the Israeli Foreign Ministry, that 4,000 families contacted the Israeli Foreign Ministry in Israel asking about how were their loved ones who were supposed to be at work in the World Trade Center or the Pentagon. They wanted to know, is he okay? Are they okay? And the Israeli Foreign Ministry reported this to the Jerusalem Post, which is the most conservative newspaper in Israel in the English language. And the Jerusalem Post put it on their website on September 12th or 13th, very early on. And this was very odd because there were only 3. Of the 4,000 that were supposed to be at work that day, only 3 died. And that's incredible. So you say, well, what happened? Well, then we found out in the New York Times, one article about a system called Odigo, which was an Israeli instant messaging system, whereby you could send a message, for example, in Hebrew, and choose Buddy Finder. I'll choose send this to all people who speak Hebrew on the network, and all people who are Israeli by nationality. So you choose the parameters, and it goes to everybody. And they can have a BlueBerry, they can have a page, they can have any kind of pager, any kind of device. All platforms were reached. It was very effective. So those 4,000 people got that message, and it only came out to the public because a couple employees of Odigo, O-D-I-G-O, in Israel, told the media that they said, we got this message too. And so the U.S. government sent the FBI agents over there to find out more about this message. Who sent it, where it came from, et cetera, et cetera. This was reported in the New York Times. Only once, mind you. And there was a follow-up story later, I think in the Washington Post, said that the president of the company of Odigo in Israel, Alex Diamandis, told the media that the message, the warning, was precise to the minute. That means that the message said, do not go to the World Trade Center today at 8:45. All hell will break loose. You don't want to be there. And that's what happened. Now, these people that got this message, none of them picked up, maybe they did, but none of them seemed to have picked up the phone and called Mr. Giuliani or the chief of police or the fire department and say, listen, I got this warning here. You better do something. Well, that's what happened. So with those 2 bits of evidence, those 2 bits of information that came in the very first week of 9/11, were printed in the newspaper. I'm not making this stuff up. One was in Jerusalem Post, New York Times, Washington Post, New York Times, and Jerusalem Post. I said, this looks very much like the Israelis had prior knowledge. They had prior knowledge. At least they had prior knowledge. And prior knowledge of such events, prior knowledge of an event like 9/11 means complicity. There's only one way you can say it. It reminded me, for example, of the prior knowledge that the Israelis had that a certain Mercedes truck of a certain color, of a certain kind, was going to drive to the Beirut airport in 1982 and blow up. And the Mossad knew about this truck. They knew what it looked like, what color it was, where it was coming from, but they only gave the American military the skimpiest of details. They said something like, there's a danger that you might have a truck bomb in the future. But they knew exactly what truck it was. It was coming from the Bekaa Valley. Now, that's what I'm saying, is that so the Israelis had this information. They knew something was going to happen. They knew it was going to happen at 8:45 in the morning, but they didn't tell anybody. So with that understanding, I began my investigation. And I used it as a working hypothesis that the Israeli intelligence, with the help of their dedicated Zionist crew in the United States, had planned this crime, the atrocity of 9/11, carried it out, and then, of course, subsequently then covered it up and promoted the deception that we're now living under today. For 13 years, we have been living under this deception. You are a remarkable group of people because you seem to understand that we've been deceived. And for every one of you, there should be 100 more at home who are afraid to come. They don't want to hear this Nazi speak or this anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist speak. I tell you, I'm none of the above. I lived in Israel. I speak Hebrew. I actually married that Israeli girl later on. But I understood, I saw how Israeli intelligence works. And all I can tell to my friends in this country who might have a rose-colored view of Israel, who have the Hollywood view of Israel, and think that it's a wonderful place, a savior for the Jewish people, I would just simply say to them that they don't know they don't know the nature of the beast. They don't know the history. Because if they know Zionist history, they would know that it's not the nice rose-colored country that they want to believe it is. But American Jews, a lot of them are invested, a lot of American Christians. There's something like 50 million Christian Zionists in this country. And they're in Sweden too, and they're in Norway, and who believe that Israel is necessary by God. This state of Israel is there because it's the harbinger of the rapture or something like that. It's all this funky kind of religion. I call it, all this funky religion, I call this false prophecy and a false Messiah. Israel, the state of Israel is like a false Messiah for the Jewish people. And they're led to believe that the strength of Israel and its strength of its military is the savior of the Jewish people. Au contraire, it's not. It's actually the greatest harm and the greatest danger to the Israeli people. It's the cause of a great deal of anti-Semitism, of real anti-Semitism. You see, after the Israelis did what they did in Gaza in July, in France they have very real anti-Semitism because they have a lot of Muslims who are really ticked off with what Israel did in Gaza. So it's just like, this sectarian divide is being increased now in Europe in the same way that it's being done in Iraq. You see? And now we're seeing that they're dragging up against 9/11 as the reason why we're going to war now in Syria. They're saying that it's all being done under the authorization of the Use of Force Act that was signed in the first week after 9/11, which gave President Bush the authority to wage war anywhere in the world against anybody who was involved in terrorism against the United States for this act, for this crime. Now Obama has enlarged that so that wherever he wants to go to war, he uses that same authorization. But what's happening now in Syria and these beheading videos and whatnot, this is basically just more of the same. It's more of the same. It's more of the same deception. It's basically like wag the dog deception. Give the people a video that's going to really hit them in the gut, and then say, well, they're beheading American journalists over there. We've got to do something. So here we go again. Here we go again. Well, in this book, I point out the Israeli history of the involvement in 9/11, and you have to understand that this was a crime that was decades in the planning. In 1979, I have it in the book here. Isser Harel, the founding father of the Mossad, told an American visiting Zionist preacher that the preacher asked, "Will terrorism ever come? Will Arab terrorism come to the United States?" And Isser Harel, the granddaddy of the Mossad, said, "Yes. Arab money buys more than tents." He said, "They will attack your tallest building in New York City because that's some sort of fertility symbol, and they want to attack that." So in 1979, he said this, and this was repeated in several articles in Israel and the United States, BeliefNet, things like that. And so how did the father of the Mossad know that the Arabs were going to bomb the biggest buildings in America, something that only happened, 21 years later, 22 years later? How's this? Well, he said that, and then at the same time, this idea of the war on terrorism started with the Netanyahu Institute. The man who's now the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and his father, Ben-Zion Netanyahu, born in Warsaw under the name Milakovsky. Ben-Zion Milakovsky changed the name to Netanyahu. They created an institute called the Netanyahu Institute on Terrorism. And they had a conference in Jerusalem in 1979 in which they basically said that the democracies of the West have to come into the Middle East and fight against the scourge of terrorism, which is hurting Israel, because this terrorism is really aimed at the whole West. So Israel was trying to like say, look, we're Western guys and you're Western guys, and they're bombing us now, but they'll bomb you in the future. So you have to all get together and go after these guys. That was called the War on Terrorism. In Israel, they called the same thing terror neged terror, terror against terror. It was a philosophy of the Israelis in the 70s and 80s. But they wanted the United States and Canada and Britain and France to wage this war against their enemies for them. And they saw that this had to be achieved somehow. So they had the Jerusalem Conference, in which Papa Bush was there, George Bush Papa was there, and other people like that. George Bush even gave a speech there. And very little is known about this Jerusalem Conference. If you look on the website for the Jerusalem Conference, you'll find very little. 1979, which is very odd. You'll find very little about the Netanyahu Institute either. It's very, very little out there. But there's a guy in San Francisco, an older Jewish fellow, who did a thesis about this. And I got the thesis, his college thesis at San Francisco State University. And he shows that all of the evidence that the Israelis were presenting was fraudulent. Take the question afterwards. All the evidence, all the rates where they talked about terrorism increasing, it was all fraudulent. And that man's last name is Paul, P-A-U-L-L. So you can find the thesis or what I wrote about online. But that's very interesting. So they're trying to promote this thesis that Western democracies should be fighting Israel's enemies because they're a threat to the West. Well, Netanyahu didn't give up. He pursued, he wrote books like called Terrorism, How the West Can Win. That came out in 1986. And I sat down and read it in one seating there in Santa Cruz. And I said, of course, he never even discusses that the Palestinians might have some legitimate grievance, and there might be some reason why they're using this kind of terrorism back. In fact, I mean, of course, the Palestinians learned from the Israelis. You know, Menachem Begin, the father of Israeli terrorism, was once asked, by a news outlet, how does it feel to be the father of terrorism in the Middle East? And he said, in the Middle East, in the whole world. See, he sees himself as the father, because in Zionist history, if you read Zionist history from the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, you see that this use of terrorism against the Palestinians and against the Brits was they really developed this way of dealing with the situation there. And so, for example, they would go into a village and kill all the people and throw explosives and hand grenades into the houses where the people are hiding and blow them all up. Like in Deir Yassin, they did this, but there are many places. And that put a fear into all the other Palestinians. They said, when the Zionists come here, they'll do to us what they did to Deir Yassin. So with this kind of fear, the Palestinian people, when the Israelis started coming, the Zionists started coming in 1948, they fled. They didn't want to be cut in pieces and dropped into the well. Now I want to say one thing about fear that's very important. It applies to us too. The use of fear is a tool of the bad guys. So if you ever find a website or any sort of newspaper that seems to be spreading fear, that's making you afraid, big red flag. That is an agency that's not on your side, because we have nothing to fear but fear itself, really. There's no reason to be afraid of anything. You shouldn't be afraid of the NSA. Don't be afraid of the FBI. Don't be afraid of Homeland Security. Don't be afraid of any of these things. Don't be afraid of the Israelis. Don't be afraid of the Mossad. They're people just like you and me. They put their pants on in the morning like you and I do. They're just people. The people that did 9/11. I have no problem calling up Michael Chertoff and asking him about his Israeli citizenship. But he didn't like that kind of thing. That's why he had this operation against me. I paid a price. Okay, we went to Europe. I was prosecuted. But, you shouldn't be afraid. And if you see somebody that's some agency or some website that's trying to make you afraid, they're doing it for a reason. They either want to sell you gold coins or silver coins or survival kits or something. Or they just want you to be afraid. Because when you're afraid, you won't take action. And I can tell you, there's a lot of people that would be here tonight were it not for fear. Okay? Well, in this book, this is one of the most important chapters. I started writing this in 2007 in order to basically vindicate myself, to show the world what my thesis was, because up until then it had only been on a website. and websites can be here one day and gone the next. And I wrote this, started writing in 2007, and my wife told me that you have to cite every single thing you say in that article. Everything I write, you have to show the sources, where it came from, who said it, the date, so that the reader can go and find it for themselves. So that's what I did. And that's very important because these books are not theory, these books are history. These are history, these are like the history books of 9/11. And the bigger book is like the history chronologically developed. And when you read when you read from 2001 through 2012, and particularly when you read it toward the end, how they destroyed the evidence, how they covered up the crime, their crime, so that the deception could live. Because you see, if they had investigated the steel, if they had investigated the dust, really, they would have found the nanothermite that Professor Jones found. They would have, even in the FEMA report, they talk about the steel beams that vaporized. They vaporized because such high temperatures were reached that steel basically vaporized. It got so hot. But that's what nanothermite and thermite do. Thermite itself is basically a cutting incendiary that cuts steel or makes steel melt so that you can join railroad tracks together, for example. It's been used for 100 years in Europe to weld railroad tracks together. But when you have the kind of stuff that Professor Jones found in the dust, he found in the dust like little paint chips of a paint like this, about this color. And he found these little tiny chips of paint in there. It was bilayered. One side was red like that, one side was silver. When you take these little chips in the laboratory and you heat them to 420 degrees Celsius, they go off with a bang. And they yield more energy, per gram than any known explosive. So when you hear the naysayers about this discovery say, oh, Bollyn, they say Bollyn, Richard Gage, and Professor Jones, they're thermite sniffers. And there's no, thermite is an incendiary. It's not an explosive. They're missing the main point. The main point is this is a nanothermetic material. That means it's made basically on a molecular level where you have almost at the molecular size, 1/10 of a micron in size and smaller. You're creating a compound where these aluminum and iron oxide are next to each other as such tiny, tiny particles that the speed of the reaction and the power of the reaction is infinitesimally faster and more powerful than regular thermite. Regular thermite goes off with a bang, but when you do it like this, it goes off with an incredible bang. So when this discovery was made about the nanothermite in the dust, that was in 2009, but we had been working on it for about 4 years prior to that. And when we really saw the evidence that was for sure what we were dealing with, I was talking about it on the radio in 2006. Professor Jones was talking about it and working on it. We were both attacked. I was attacked in August of that year. He was attacked September 7th of that year. We were both removed from our sources of income. I was fired as a journalist by the American Free Press. He was suspended from teaching at BYU. And so then they let him continue to do his research, which was very important, but he no longer had an income. And now he's even left Utah. He's gone to Missouri, from what I heard. He's going to start, maybe he's going to teach in Illinois. But you have to ask yourself, why were we attacked? Well, we were the ones who found the clearest evidence of thermite. I had written about it in 2002 when I talked to the men who removed the steel from the World Trade Center. When they removed the steel and got down to the 7th basement level, and they got down to the bedrock of Manhattan, they found pools of molten, they called it steel, it was really molten iron, in the molten state. That means they found pools of molten iron that were 1,200 degrees Celsius, in the molten state. And Peter Tully told me that. Tully was one of the 4 contractors. I said, this is very interesting. He came out with this. I didn't know about it. He just came out with this to me. So I then called Mark Loiseau from Controlled Demolition Incorporated of Maryland. He was the guy who ran the whole thing, how they were going to remove the rubble and take it to the barges and get rid of it. So I asked him, Peter Tully told me that you all found molten iron at the bottom of the World Trade Center. And he said, yes, it was molten all right. And he said in the basements of all 3 towers, 1, 2, and 7. 7 is the 47-story tower that fell at 5:20 in the afternoon. So in the basements of all these 3 buildings, they found this rubble. This molten steel, molten iron, in the molten state. That's very important. Now you have to ask yourself, now wait a minute. there's been a huge mountain, maybe 10 stories high, of steel, and they've been spraying water on it 24/7 for 3 months, until the fires went out. Those fires, those hot spots were burning basically until New Year's 2001, until Christmas, after Christmas 2001. So for 3 months, so the people who walked on the pile, their shoes were melting. And there was this thin blue smoke, like car exhaust, rising from the pile. And what happened in Davis, California, a professor there, an aerosol professor, sent what's called a Davis drum, and it was put on a roof near the World Trade Center. And whenever that smoke went up and passed through that drum, that device called a Davis drum measured the size of the particles and what they were. And what Thomas Cahill, his name is Thomas A. Cahill, from the Delta group at UC Davis, what he found was that the abundance, the great majority of the particles in that smoke were, again, at the nano size level. That means smaller than 1/10 of a micron in diameter. Extremely small. Now, this is very important to understand. When particles are that small in smoke, he told me, I said, what could explain that? He said, they can only be produced by fires hotter than the boiling point of the metal involved. So that means that if it's a particle of iron, it was created in a fire that was hotter than the boiling point. So I wrote an article, why did iron boil in the beneath the World Trade Center? And it's like one of the chapters in this book. It's why did iron boil? And when I wrote that article, I'd gone from Provo, met Jones. It was the spring of 2006. I went to Davis. When they told me this, I asked these guys at Davis Institute, I said, do you realize what this means? And they were afraid. They didn't want to talk about it. They had the data, but they didn't want to talk about what it meant because they're federally funded. It's a completely federally funded, institute. And so I could see that. I was talking to this one guy, and I was like, I could see this guy just doesn't want to get it. He doesn't want to even talk about it. And Thomas Cahill also. They're not going to go there. They protect the government version about 9/11. The data says what the data says, but they don't want to talk about it. Well, when I wrote that article, I was in Davis, California, and I was on my way back to Provo, and I had got some papers about the dust from the United States Geological Survey, and I was ready to go, and I talked to my newspaper, and they cut my travel allowance from $1,000 a month to zero. I always had a travel allowance of, first it was unlimited, like $1,500 to $2,000 a month for hotels, for gas, for driving, for renting a car, all that stuff. I don't own a car, so I would rent a car. And when they did that, that meant that I basically had to go back to Chicago. And I didn't want to go to Chicago. I didn't want to go to my home in Hoffman Estates because the FBI had set up a team around me of people who had befriended me who were basically providing the FBI with information. And these people were also telling me this. It's like they wanted me to know that FBI was watching me. And they would tell us, yeah, well, some FBI agents came to my house today and asked, a couple hours they were interviewing me. They asked a lot of questions about you. Oh, that's nice. That's nice. Another guy, a Lebanese guy who I had known for a couple of years, he was just a neighbor there. He came in one day and he said, yeah, I got a second job now. I work for the FBI. It's like, so we chose in the fall of 2005 to go back to Europe. We were like a ping pong ball going back to Europe, coming back when we thought it was safe, not safe, go back to Europe. Well, in 2006 I saw it really wasn't safe because when they cut my travel allowance to zero, I did have to go back to Chicago. I went to a family reunion in Montana, I dallied, we went to another reunion in North Dakota. But then we had very little money, the kids wanted to go home, they missed their bicycles, so we went there. I was home only 10 days, and the police attack happened at my house. But I knew something was coming because the very first day I got home, I was on the roof fixing the vent, the air vent for the utility room, and I was putting a router down from the roof into this vent. I was trying to clear out that vent, and a police car drove right in front of my house and stopped. He's looking at me. I'm on the roof, it's morning, fixing the roof, and this police car's looking at me, so it's like I say, yeah, now he knows we're back. He knows we're back. And then there's a police presence around our house. I was watching, because we have a lot of windows, and they were going around our house like all the time, 7, 10 times a day. And then, finally, the day before the attack, I saw a car going around my house with 3 men wearing body armor and unidentified men, but they had body armor on, and they were armed. I didn't know who they were. So the first day I told my wife, I said, this car is going around our house. I don't know, it's really weird. I've never seen anything like this before. And then the next day, at the end of the day, I come out of my porch on the stoop there, and these car drives by again, just like in Gran Torino. They got the windows rolled down. They're driving by in front of my house very slowly, looking at me like this. Just like in Gran Torino with Clint Eastwood, when he has that gang driving by in front of his house. I said, and the kids are in the front yard, and I just said, say hello to the FBI guys. I told the kids, say hello to the FBI. They're looking at me, what's Dad talking about? Well, those police heard that comment. They even heard that comment. That's how close they were. Well, I thought about it for a minute. I told Helia, there's still these cars around the house. I called 911 after I went to the store, and I said, I should call. This is very unusual. So I called 911, and they said, we'll send an officer to your house. I said, well, send him in about 20 minutes because I got to buy some food for dinner, and I'll be back in about 20 minutes. Well, about 20 minutes later, I'm in the kitchen. I look out the front window, and I see that these very same three men that I was afraid of have marched up my driveway, and my Estonian wife is standing there, stopped them. She has the gardening shears in her hand. She's been trimming the bushes. My little 8-year-old daughter is standing next to her. I said, son of a gun, what is this? So I should have stayed in the house. I should have hidden in the crawl space or something, but I ran right out, went by my wife, and I went with these three men. They were standing about as close as you and I are here. There were three men standing on my driveway, on my property, mind you. And I said, who are you? What agency are you with? Because my wife had been asking for identification. They had given none to her either. I said, what agency are you with? Why are you threatening our neighborhood with this gear and this car? And the one guy right in front of me, Michael Barber, he says, oh, we're threatening your neighborhood, are we? And he reached for a piece and behind his back leg, because they had the guns on the back leg and back here. And I said, wait, I have to get my brother. And when somebody reaches for a gun, that's the first thing you can do is get out of there. And I said, I get my brother. And I went 2-3 steps. They tackled me on the lawn. This hand was stuck under my body. I was on top of that. And this hand was in handcuff. And Michael Barber, the one who had reached for a piece, was kneeling on my backside, on my legs here. And the other guy, one of the other guys, was kneeling on my temple. So they had my head. He was kneeling on my head right here with his full body weight. This is makes your eyes bulge. It cuts off brain. It cuts off the flow of blood to your brain. It should not ever be used for more than 1 minute because it can cause brain damage. My wife said my eyes were bulging out of my head. She went in the house to get a camera. She wanted to take a picture of this, and as she came out of the house, the third officer, who's called the lethal officer, he got in front of her and he's going like this. He says, if you take a picture, we'll arrest you too. And so she said, well, if they arrest her, who's going to take care of the kids? Well, they had that all figured out. This crew had come to my house. The man who was running the operation, Michael Barber, was actually an officer of Homeland Security. And he had worked, for example, down in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina with a machine gun. So this is what we have now in this country. We have officers in every police station in the country who are basically seconded to Homeland Security. So they've been through Homeland Security training. They are the liaison with Homeland Security in Washington. And if Homeland Security needs something done in your town, they'll call up Michael Barber, for example, in my case. Mike, we have this neo-Nazi skinhead, whatever they wanted to call me. He's a bad guy, and we want you to go and give him some hard time. And I went the next morning to the police department, and I talked to the chief and the village manager, and I said, my first question was, I wanted to know what is the military background of these men. And I wasn't far off, because the two men that ran the operation, Barber and the other fella, had learned their police training in Iraq, of course. They were MPs. And they had not gone to any police training in the United States. They were, in my town, Hoffman Estates, you don't have to have a college degree. So if you have military training from Iraq as an MP, fine, we can use you. The other chap who knelt on my head, he was a former Cook County jail guard, which is where he learned such tricks. Well, I was then prosecuted. They wanted to say that I had assaulted them, and when I got up off the ground, and I was in handcuffs, then I said, "Why are you arresting me? What have I done? I called 911, and you come here and beat me up and are arresting me on my property. I haven't done nothing." Of course, they didn't give any answers. They just treated me very badly, took me off to the police station, and abuse after abuse after abuse, kind of like Chicago style, what they do. Like, for example, I was parched like this, like I am now, and I said, I need a glass of water. They put me in a cell, and I went to push the button on the wall where the water should come out. There was no water. I said, I need some water. And the officers outside the bar said, drink from the toilet. It's like, what? And it was ongoing. And I said, why are these guys so hostile to me? What have I done? I mean, I'm a son of a village founder. My mother started the library. We started the Episcopalian church. Why are they attacking me? When the police car drove into the garage, there were 12 officers waiting for the car to let me out, and they all were wearing green rubber gloves. And, oh, thank you very much. Thank you. And I said, thank you very much. And when I got out of the car, I said, oh no, now they're going to work me over. I said, when they opened the door of the car, I said, I'm a journalist, and whatever you do to me, I will write about. I think it had a sobering effect. But then they charged me with assaulting them and resisting arrest. In Illinois, they want you to cop a plea. You have to plead one or the other to make it more easygoing for yourself. This is what everybody has to do. If you say, I'm innocent, that requires a trial. I said, I'm innocent. But of course, your lawyers don't want to have a trial. They don't want to do it. But I got a 4-day trial, completely corrupt. None of my evidence was allowed. My expert witness wasn't allowed. At one point, it was a crazy trial. One time the prosecutor says, oh, Mr. Bollyn, and so who was behind 9/11? The judge, of course, stop, conference. They didn't want to hear about that. But when the jury was hung, and 50-50, but the clerk went back there. I was in a situation where the judge was a Zionist, the clerk was a Zionist, and the prosecutor was a Zionist. And one of my supporters had gone to the prosecutor's office and said, why are you prosecuting Bollyn? He's done nothing wrong. And the prosecutor, Bloomberg or something, he said, well, I've looked at Mr. Bollyn's writings, and I find them to be anti-Jewish, and the prosecution will go on. So that's what I was facing. So I wrote the book to show, to put it all together. I had all these articles that I'd been writing. I knew what 9/11 was about, but then I sat down when I got to Europe. First we went to Norway, then we went to Sweden, finally in Estonia. And I started writing. And Estonia is a very good place to write because there's nothing else to do there. It's very cold. I don't speak Estonian. We lived in the countryside. It's very Spartan, and it was ideal for writing and thinking. I was doing a lot of heavy writing and thinking. I would spend my whole days researching and writing, following up leads, and I still had access to my good library databases so I could find these articles, and I started putting it together piece by piece by piece, which is what this book is all about. And my wife told me that you had to cite everything. I did that, and the book was, there was an Estonian publisher who knows my wife, who owns all the media in Estonia. It's a very small country of 1.5 million people. And she knows this man. His name is Hans Luik. He owns all the media in Estonia. He's sponsored by the Rothschilds in Britain. This is how they do it. Like they create a millionaire, a local millionaire, like you. You want to help Mr. Rothschild? You will be our media millionaire. We'll make you a millionaire. You just had a little weekly paper. Now you'll own all the papers. And you'll own the TV stations too. And this man wanted to, he pretended that he wanted to print my book in Estonia, which I thought, okay, he'll do it. Let's see. Because at that time, you still needed to have a publisher. And I said, okay, and he took one chapter of the book, chapter 7, is called The Architecture of Terrorism, in which I show the whole flow chart, all these people, these Israelis, high-level Israelis, who are involved in the 9/11 setup, the whole thing. And there's a lot of statements of fact in that chapter. He sent it to an English fact checker in Britain who was hostile to my thesis completely. He checked 105 facts and found not a single one to be wrong. All 105 statements of fact were correct. And Hans Luik said, well, wow, congratulations, Christopher, you got a perfect mark on that. I said, what did you expect? I mean, the information that I put in this, it's not coming from me. It's coming from open sources and sources that are verifiable. And I would not put anything in the book that could not be verified. Like, for example, there's that comment that Ariel Sharon said, like in 2001, he told Shimon Peres, Shimon, you're always worrying about the Americans. Shimon, let me tell you, you don't have to worry about the Americans. The Jews control America, and they know it. But that was supposedly said on, you know, Kol Israel, you know, and I have not verified it. Maybe he did say it, maybe he didn't. But because I couldn't verify it, I didn't put it in the book. You see, I want the book to be history, not any sort of, you know, the facts of 9/11 are damning enough. There's no reason, you don't have to add any fuel to the fire, no speculation, no conjecture. The facts say enough.